Going to go through a simple task for term 3, and we are going to analyze some of the questions that are posed in that task. Right, I understand we do different topics, we focus on different areas, but for this discussion, we are going to concentrate on the question on the impact of British colonialism on the population of the Cape, how the British impacted the lives of people who were staying in the Cape region. Right, that is our focus for the source-based questions. Then for the essay question, we are going to focus on cooperation and conflict in the Highveld, where we look at the Boers, the British, and the Basotho, how they cooperated and how they were engaged in some conflicts. That's the essay focus. So if you are also focusing on the same questions, and also if you are focusing on the same structure of the focus of the questions, like if you are having your impact of colonialism on the Cape as a source-based question, we are going to discuss it as a source-based question. But however, be mindful that it can be changed to an essay question, or it can come as a source-based question, depending on the choice of your district or your province. Right. So we're going to look at this question, which says, what was the impact of British colonialism on the population of the Cape Colony? We want to look at how the British impacted the population of the Cape Colony. Right. So we have our sources from source 1A to source 1D. The first question is saying, according to the source, what was the initial aim of British control of the Cape? What was the initial aim? Right, this is an extraction question, which means we just need to go to the source and analyze how the coming of the British, what was their aim? Right, if we check in our source, we are told that the arrival of the British at the Cape, if you check the first part, it's talking about the arrival of the British at the Cape. The arrival of the British at the Cape changed the lives of the people who were already living there. Initially, British control was aimed at protecting the trade route to the east. Protecting the trade route to the east. That was the initial aim. They wanted to protect the trade route to the east, to link their trading activities to the east. So they wanted to protect, and the Cape being a strategic point along the route, they also got interest in the Cape as part of their mission to protect the trade route to the east. So our response is an extraction question. That is where we get our answer for the first question. The initial aim was to protect the trade route to the east. To protect the trade route to the east. Protect trade route to the east. It's an extraction question. It's a level 1 question, which means we get our response from the source directly. Right, we move on to the next question. Right, this is a concept. Define the term colonialism in your own words. Right, when you're defining, you must not force yourself to memorize how the concept is defined in the textbook or how it is defined on the internet. When you're talking of colonialism as a historical concept, we are saying it's a process where a stronger country takes control of another country. That's the idea of colonialism. The basic understanding of colonialism, we are saying there's one powerful country, and that powerful country is ambitious. It's taking over the control of other countries. That is the concept of colonialism. You can define it in any other dimension, but the main idea is there must be a country which is ultimately taking control or taking over the affairs of another country. Why? Because of its military power. It has the capacity to overpower the lesser strong country and take control of that particular country. That is colonialism. Right. We move on to the next question. The next question is saying, use your own knowledge to explain why the Khoi community disintegrated. All right, let's try to check from the source and try to get an idea. Right. We are seeing that in the source, it says, whatever it says, let's go to this part. Others, however, such as the Khoi communities of the Southwest Cape, disintegrated within a matter of decades. Right. We are saying, because of colonialism, we are seeing a situation here where the Khoi communities, they became disintegrated. They were no longer united. They were spaced apart. They were no longer united as one, a distinct group. They became disintegrated because of the impact of colonialism by the British. So we want to try to figure out why these communities were disintegrated. Why were they now disjointed? Unlike what they used to be in the earlier days before the coming of the British. Right. So we are going to find some justifications here. This is our question number 1.1.4. 1.1.3. Yeah, it's 1.1.3. We're looking at the explanation to why the communities were disintegrated. Right. So it's 113. I'll try to highlight some of the possible reasons. 112. Right. We can explain that these Khoi communities, they were affected by diseases. So one of the reasons is they died of diseases. These diseases were brought by the colonialists. So because of this reason, they became disjointed. Most of them, they died. These British, they brought diseases, and to them, they had immunity, meaning to say they were not ultimately affected by those diseases. But once they got into contact with the Khoi were not immune to those diseases. They died. And also, why were they disintegrated? They were driven off their land. They were driven off their land for that reason. The British were expanding their territory into the zones that were occupied by the Khoi, and they were driving them off their land. So as a result, they became disjointed because of the effect of the expansion of the British colony of the Cape. Right. And also the other reason, they became forced laborers. We understand that the Khoi were also engaged in forced labor by the British. So because of that effect, they continued to disintegrate. Some of them were taken by the colonialists to supply cheap labor, supply forced labor. So they also became disintegrated because of the effect of them being forced to supply labor to the farmers, the white farmers. And also, the other reason, they also had clashes. They had clashes with the trade boers. They fought with the trade boers in most instances. And because of that, they could not continue as a united group. They became disintegrated. Right. So if we check, those are some of the reasons that you can argue upon and try to justify why the communities became disintegrated. Right, we move on to the next question. If you check, comment on the impact that colonization had on the indigenous people of the Cape. What kind of impact was brought by colonization? And we want to analyze, to comment on the impact that colonization had on the indigenous people. Was it a positive impact? Was it a negative impact? Right. If we check the effect of colonization on the indigenous people, um, we are just talking about some of these effects here. This number 114. Right. The impact was negative. Why are we saying it was negative? We are talking of the disintegration of the Khoi community. So the Khoi community, Khoi community became disintegrated. It clearly shows that it was an impact which was negative on the people. Initially, before the coming of the colonialists, they were staying as a united group, having organized activities, managing their own life, and doing their own things. But however, because of the coming of the colonialists, the British community became disintegrated. So it's an impact. They had a negative implication on the community of the Khoi. They became disintegrated because of the impact of colonialism and the coming of the colonialists. Right. And also we can, on a positive note, we can say it also um, led to the emancipation of slaves. Right. It was also positive on one side. It led to the emancipation of the slaves. Remember the Boers, they, they were engaged in slavery of the African people. The African communities were enslaved. But however, when the British came, they abolished slavery. So it was a positive impact on the communities. They were emancipated. Then it was also positive as we look on the side of technology. The coming of the colonialists, they brought technology. We can give examples here of firearms. Initially, the African societies did not have access to the firearms. They did not even know about such inventions. But because of the coming of the whites, the coming of the colonialists, they brought with them some technology and also including the firearms, which made it a little bit easier for the African societies to go through their daily activities like hunting. Right. So we are checking if the question is saying impact, impact can either be positive or negative. So here we've looked at either side, the negative side, and also we've addressed the positive side of the colonization that happened in the Cape. Right. Moving on to the next question. Um, According to the source, when did the banning of the slave trade become effective? Right. This is an extraction question. We just need to go to the source. When this is a time factor, we want the time when the banning was effective. Right, so which means we have to go to our source 1B. Source 1B, it examines the laws Britain passed when they ruled the Cape Colony. Right, so it says, if we check here, the first statement, in 1807, the British outlawed the slave trade. The ban took effect on 1 January 1808. So our time here, when we want the time factor, that was January 1, 1808. That was when it was effective. So it was effective on the 1st of January 1808. That was when the um, effect when it was effected in January 1808. Right. Moving on to the next question. Quote from the source. The reason for the increased exploitation of farm laborers. We want to find out the reason why there was increased exploitation, why farm laborers were continuously exploited, and why the rate of exploitation was increasing. Right, so it's an extraction question. We're going to quote. Right, it says here, as the demand for exports rose, the exploitation of all farm laborers increased. So the reason that we can quote here, our reason is here, as the demand for exports rose. That is where we get our answer. That is what we must extract. So it means we are saying as the demand for exports rose. That was the reason that facilitated the increased exploitation. It meant if there was an increase in the demand for exports, it also implied that the British were supposed to export more. And for them to be able to export more, they were supposed to produce more. So for them to produce more, they were supposed to exploit the worker. And the workers were exploited more because of the need for the British to feed the gap of the increase in the levels of exports. Right. Moving on to the next question. Explain the term vagrancy in the context of British rule in the Cape Colony. Vagrancy. And let's try to go to the source and try to figure out sense of how the term is used in the source. Right. Officials passed, if you check this statement here in the first paragraph, starting from here, officials passed new laws to curb vagrancy, a term applied to Khoi who wandered around without permanent residence. Now they issued passes to the Khoi who were seeking work or traveling. So we are seeing the effect there. We are trying to figure out the sense of the concept. It is saying officials passed the new laws to curb, this is to control, to curb, to control vagrancy. They wanted to control vagrancy, which was a term applied to Khoi who wandered around without permanent residence. So our answer is clear there. If someone is a vagrant, we know of a vagrant as a person who doesn't have any fixed abode. They do not have a permanent residence. They just stay anywhere, anyhow, like people on the streets with no fixed place of stay. Those are vagrants. So the Khoi were also regarded as vagrancy because of the impact of colonialism. They were now wandering around, moving all over because their places, their original places were taken and they were being driven off the land. So they were trying to find a way of survival. So they were moving up and down, trying to find a way of survival, a new way of survival after being driven off their lands and off their productive lands. So they were vagrancy. So in this sense, we are saying a vagrant is someone who is wandering around. If you're a vagrant, it means it's someone who just wanders around without wandering around of the Khoi. Without permanent residence. That is vagrants. They were just wandering. The Khoi were just wandering around without any permanent settlement or any permanent place of residence. Right. Moving on to the next question. Why, according to the source and your knowledge, was pass law issued to the Khoi? Why did the officials introduce the pass laws? Right. If we check there, the pass laws, we understand a pass, it was an official document which allowed the Khoi to be in a specific place at some specific given time. Why did they regulate their movement? Why were they targeting to control their movement? That is what the question is requiring. So we can try to figure out the sense of why the officials introduced the pass laws. That is number 1, 2, 4. Right. So number 1, 2, 4. We can argue that it was meant to control the movement of the Khoi and also regulate their traveling. Because of the need for having a pass as an official document to allow the Khoi to move, they were regulated. So they were introducing the pass laws as a way of trying to control the movement of the Khoi and also regulate their traveling. And also, on their side, the most beneficial part of the pass to the British was that to make the Khoi to stay with one employer. It was a way of also controlling the labor of the Khoi. If they didn't have a pass to go to any other employer, it meant that they would not leave the current employer. So it was also a way of regulating the supply of labor. They wanted to control and regulate the supply of labor from the Khoi by restricting their movement so that they will stay with one employer. It meant they would not change employers provided that they don't have official documents which will allow them to move. So that was how they used or how they instituted the pass laws to their benefit. It was to the benefit of the white employer. And also we can argue that kept vagrancy. To control vagrancy, the same Khoi were now vagrants who were just moving up and down, trying to find a way of life, trying to find new employers. So as a way of controlling vagrants, they would be given the passes at the end of their contracts, which meant that if they didn't have a pass or if the contract wouldn't have lapsed, it meant that they would not go anywhere. And that was going to control the movement of the Khoi, the vagrancy, which was now happening where the Khoi were now wandering around. They've left their employer who was providing them a place to stay. Once they've left the employer, it meant that they wouldn't be having any other place to stay because their original homes were the land was taken by the colonialists. So they didn't have any other permanent places to stay except to look for jobs amongst the employers. So which meant that transitional period of you coming from one employer trying to figure out another employer, then it was going to cause the problem of vagrancy. People just moving anyhow without any place, any permanent place of residence. Right. We move on to the next question. Right. What positive influence did Ordinance 50 have on the Khoi and on the slaves? We want to look at positive influence that was brought by Ordinance 50. Right. If we try to check Ordinance 50, it was a regulation which was put in place. Let's check here. Under humanitarian pressure, however, we are reading paragraph number 2. Under humanitarian pressure, however, these harsh measures were moderate. The passing of Ordinance 50 in 1828 applied primarily to the Khoi. Under this law, they received the right to buy and own land. we are seeing here. Because of the ordinance, the Khoi, they received the right to buy and own land and to agree to enter into service contracts. This is the benefit of Ordinance 50 to the Khoi. And also continuing, the new legislation made it more difficult to split up enslaved families. We are seeing here, split up enslaved families. It was now difficult. So the slaves, they benefited from that law because they could no longer be separated from their family members. And also, a newly appointed guardian of slaves began to hear formal complaints about harsh treatment. So if you try to analyze your responses, we can see that our response, you are supposed to give it 1 on the Khoi and 2 on the slaves. So A on the Khoi and 2B on the slaves. So this, if you analyze our responses, this is a benefit to the Khoi, the right to buy and own land. And another benefit, which is separate, agree to enter into service contracts. So these are 2 different responses. Any of those qualifies to be the positive influence on the Khoi. Then on the slaves, the new legislation made it more difficult to split up enslaved families. It's a benefit. Made it more difficult to split up enslaved families. And another benefit, guarding of slaves began. A newly appointed guardian of slaves began to hear formal complaints. It meant that if the employers could no longer harshly treat the slaves, because now there was a guardian who was supposed to attend to the concerns of the enslaved people. So those were the benefits that were brought by Ordinance 50. Right. We move on to the next question. Why, in your opinion, would the Dutch settlers or the Boers be angry on the passing of Ordinance 50? Right, the Boers were angered by the passing of Ordinance 50. Why were they angry? We are seeing that Ordinance 50 is now changing the way the Boers were supposed to treat the slaves. Is giving in some other new regulations which also allows for the Khoi to own land and also to enter into service contracts. So the Boers were not happy. Remember the old way of life before the coming of the British, the Boers were doing whatever they deemed necessary on the slaves. They were enslaving the indigenous people and treating them harshly. But however, because of the coming of the Ordinance 50, now things became moderate. Now it was just more of a justified way of life, of treatment of the indigenous African people. So why were they angered? We can say the Dutch were angry because they lost laborers. The fact that the Khoi were allowed to own land and to buy land, it implied that most of them, they chose not to continue working for the Boers. They were now owning their own land because they were allowed so by Ordinance 50. So it meant that the Boers, they lost their laborers and they were not happy because of that. And also, we can talk of the compensation. Compensation was not enough. The compensation was supposed to be given to the Boers as they lost part of their land. It was not enough for them. Remember, they were making profits from those lands. Those are piece of lands. But however, the compensation that was given by the British to compensate them for the loss of land was insufficient to cater for the loss that they had incurred. And so, because of that, that was one of the sparking reasons of the trek of the Great Trek. It led to the Boers deciding to move away from the British controlled Cape Colony because they were not happy. They organized themselves and moved away as the Great Trek. Right. We got source 1C. According to the source, our urban settlers left the Cape between 1834 and 1840. We are seeing now that the Boers, because they were angered by Ordinance 50, they are now moving away from the Cape region to try and establish their own territory where they would control themselves and implement measures which are friendly to their own ways of running the economy and also of managing affairs around. Right. So the source says between 1834 and 1840, an estimate of one historian, some 15,000 descendants of the early Dutch, French, and German settlers, including women, men, and children, assembled there, whatever. Right. So, according to the estimate, it meant there were around 15,000 of them who chose to trek between 1934 and 1940. So it's around 15,000 of them. So we can see that it was quite a big number of them who moved away from the British in the Cape as the Great Trek, trying to establish a new territory where they would assemble themselves and rule themselves independently from the British. Right. Then we move on to the next question. Define the term Great Trek according to your own knowledge. We are talking about the Great Trek here. What was the Great Trek? The Great Trek, defining each in simple terms, we are saying the grouping who left the Cape because of the unfavorable laws that were introduced by the British. Right, in simple terms, when I talk of the Great Trek, we are saying this was a grouping of the Afrikaner people who chose to move away from the Cape. Why? The conditions that they were used to were now changing. The British had taken over and were introducing measures which were fair, which are allowed for fair treatment of the Africans. And for that reason, they were not happy with the introduction of some of the reforms, which were now changing the situation to give and afford favorable conditions to indigenous people. So they chose to move away from the Cape to go and establish their own territory. So that grouping of people who chose to move away from the British rule because of the introduction of some regulations which were restrictive on their practices was what we regard to as the Great Trek. Right, let's move on to the next question. Is this source useful to a historian studying the reasons for the Great Trek? Is this source useful? Right. When you are looking at usefulness of a source, usefulness, remember your questions in history. We have a question on usefulness of a source. We have a question on a limitation. Let me use a bigger space so that maybe we can clarify that so that you don't confuse. Right. When you're looking at sources and you are looking at usefulness, we have questions on usefulness of sources. Then we also have questions on limitation of sources. Right. Then we also have questions on aspects like reliability. Right. So when you're looking at usefulness of a source, we are trying to find out what uh, tangible information is provided in the source. Or we want information of substance, something which is of substance in the source. What is the source telling us, which is very important towards understanding of a certain historical event? Like, for example, if the source is giving us names of people who organized the Great Trek, it's giving us the exact reasons of why there was the Great Trek. It's giving us the legislations that were put in place, which infuriated the Boers and prompted their move from the Cape region. That is useful information. It's something which is tangible, something which is of value in the source, which might help us understand the events better. Right. Then we have limitation. We are saying a source can be limited, is providing insufficient information, or cannot give us a clear picture. For example, if a source is biased, a source can be biased. If a source is biased, then it means it's limited. It's giving us one side of the view. Like, for example, in this instance, we are looking at the British introducing laws and the reaction by the Boers. If a source is to be, is not to be limited, it must give us the two sides of the story, which means it was not biased. It's giving us the view of the British and also giving the view of the Boers. Right. Then when we're looking at reliability, we are saying, can we trust? Can we trust the source? Is the source reliable? Can we trust? Is this the truth of what happened? So our question, however, is focusing on usefulness. So we want to analyze the usefulness of that source. Right. So our source is useful. Why are we saying our source is useful? Like if we check here, it says an estimate of one historian, some 15,000 descendants of the early Dutch. This is useful information. It's giving us an estimate of the number of people who were involved in the Great Trek. It's useful information. And if we check, it is also giving us the groups of people who were involved. The early Dutch, the French, the German. It's something of substance. If it just says between 1834 and 1850 and 1840, a large number of people gathered and started to move away from the Cape Colony. There is nothing useful there. One, we don't know how many they were. It's just saying a large number of people. And we don't know which kind of people were there, which classification or which classification of people were there. There's no useful information there. It's just narrative. There's no substance information there. But if we check here, we are seeing that it's giving us an estimate of the number of people who were involved in the Great Trek. And it's also giving us the groupings of the people. They were the Dutch, the French, the German. That is useful information. Right. It's also giving us the reasons for the Great Trek. Why did they move? They were angered at receiving one-fifth value of what they deemed their property. Slave owners were amongst the leaders of the Exodus. Right. They were uh, infuriated by the impact of the Ordinance 50. So we are also given reasons why they moved away from the Cape. It's also useful information. So by looking at this, we can safely say it's useful because it gives the number of people, the estimated number of people, which is estimated at 15,000. And also, it gives us the groups of people who were involved. It talks about the Dutch, it talks about the German, it talks about the French. This is useful information. And also, we can say it's useful. It gives us the reasons, the ideas for the reasons. Instead of just saying the people were engaged in a great trek, why were they moving away? It's also giving us the reasons why those people chose to move away. That is useful information that you can get in that particular source. Right, moving on to the next question. What is the name of the event that is shown on this visual source? What is the name of the event? Right, this is our visual source. We are seeing these white guys with their ox drawn carts and with their valuables and all their properties, their animals. They are packing their things in preparation to move away from the Cape. So that's portrayal on the picture. What is it called? That is the question. So automatically we are talking about the Great Trek, and we are also seeing evidence there that these guys are in preparation of movement. So automatically that's the Great Trek. That's the Great Trek, which is being portrayed here. The Great Trek. Right, list the belongings as shown in the source that the trekkers took with them when they left the Cape. That is number 1.4.2. We want to find out a list of belongings that they took. So by merely looking at that, we can see the belongings from the source. Our source here is showing us their belongings. Whatever you can figure out here is part of their belongings. Whatever you might think of is being loaded here is part of their belongings. Their animals, their pets, their livestock, or whatever you can think about as a belonging of someone who is moving permanently away from a given place qualifies to be a correct response to that one. Right, then moving on, when you're comparing sources, compare source 1C and 1D. I'll give you the clue on how you compare sources. Then you must be able to figure out how you are supposed to do that question. But when you're comparing sources, we are saying we use a specific format for source comparison. When you're doing source comparison or source contrast. When you're comparing sources, source comparison, you are supposed to figure out what is it that is in source. We're comparing source 1C and we're comparing source 1C and 1D. One C and 1D. But what you're supposed to do when you're comparing sources, we use this format here. You say in your response, source 1C is a written source, source 1C. Says you pick an idea, and this is supported by source 1D. Remember, source 1D is a visual. Source 1D, which shows whatever. That is how you compare sources. And for this response, you get 2 marks, which means this question is a 2 by 2 equal to 4, meaning to say you must give another independent comparison. Find one idea here. How is it portrayed in the first source? And how is the same idea presented in the visual source? That is 2 marks. And you go and identify another independent response of an aspect which is in source 1C, which is also supported in the other source. So in your presentation, that is how you must present your answer. This is the prescribed format of presenting a comparison or a contrast question. So we need one response which compares 2 sources and another response which compares the other aspects of the same sources. So if, for example, if you come here, you have to identify something in this source. Identify something in this source, right? And try to find out how it is presented in the other source. Let me give us an example. This one here is saying descendants of the early Dutch, French, and German settlers are the ones who were engaged in the Great Trek. How is it supported? We are told that it was the Dutch, the French, and the German. We know that these are white races. The Dutch are white, the French are white, the German are also white. This is supported by the visual impression here. It's showing white people. If you check these people here, it's portraying that they are white. So it's a comparison. The first source is saying they were the British, the French, and the German. And this is supported by the visual source, which shows white people. You get the idea of how you compare. Then you also try to figure out another independent response. Right. It says it included women, men, and children. Those were involved in the Great Trek. They were women, they were men, and children. How is it supported? It's supported here. This is a man, this is a woman, this is a child. You see these 2 children here? You see this woman, you see this woman, you see these men who are loading. So that is how you compare the sources. Find something in the first source and show how it is also portrayed in the other source. You can also talk of this one here. Piled their household goods, their furniture, their agricultural implements, and weapons. Those are some of the goods that they took. Their household goods, their furniture, their agricultural implements. How is it supported? It's supported here. We can actually see that this is furniture. Probably it's a table. Their household goods, probably they are pegged here. Whatever, it's supporting. And it also saying, there's another idea here that I also want you to figure out. It's also saying they used what? Covered wagons. How is that supported? A covered wagon is shown here. This is a covered wagon. So that is basically how we compare the sources. Just get one idea. The major problem that learners have is that of copying sources. You copy the whole sentence, and at the end of the day, you fail to split the points which were supposed to be separate and supposed to be independent and be giving you 4 marks. You get only maximum 2 marks because you are bunching in ideas. Like you are saying, the Great Trek was comprised of men, women who packed their household goods into covered wagons. Yes, there are 3 different ideas that you have infused into one point. The idea of men, women, and children must be independent because it can be supported in the visual. The idea of packing their goods, their farm implements, there can be supported. The idea of using covered wagons can be an independent idea. That is basically how you compare the sources. Right. We move on to our last question. Our last question is the paragraph question. I think we are going on to the last question. Right. Our last question is a paragraph question. Using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of about 8 lines in which you explain the impact of the British colonialism on the population of the Cape Colony. I will just highlight how you answer your paragraph question. Remember, when you're answering paragraph questions, you answer your paragraph in the prescribed appeal format. You use the appeal format. The very same way you write your paragraphs in the essay should be the same way you write your paragraph when you're answering the paragraph question. Write a P for a point or an answer to the question, which is your line of argument. You must give a clear answer to the question, because what is required there is for you to answer the question first. Give an independent answer to the question or respond directly to the question before you explain anything. That is your first part. Your opening statement of your paragraph must be explaining or must be giving the answer, must have a clear point answering the question. Then the E is for explain. You are now explaining your answer, and you must explain in your own words. Write about 2 statements explaining your answer. You are explaining your independent answer. Why have you answered the question in that direction? You are explaining, you are giving explanation. Then you want evidence. Here, that is where you use sources. You are now extracting and you quote the sources that you have consulted. And then you link back to the line of argument. Or you show how your paragraph is answering the question. That is a link. How is that answering the question? What you are saying and what you are explaining. How is it that answering the question? Right. So we are saying in this instance, the question is asking about the impact of the colonialism on the people, people at the Cape. Right. Our question is saying, explain. Write a paragraph in which you explain the impact of British colonialism on the population of the Cape. Right. So in this one, you must take an independent answer according to your understanding. How can you classify the impact? Because when we're talking of impact, we are saying impact is not one-sided. It can be a positive impact or it can be a negative impact. So in this instance, I can advise you to adopt a line of argument which caters for either side. So like you are saying, British colonialism, when you're open, you must want an answer first, because the question is asking about the impact. So your answer might be British colonialism had both positive and negative impacts. So that you can accommodate for the different dimensions of impacts that were posed on different groups. It brought both positive and negative impacts to the population of the Cape. This is your answer. There is an answer because the question is saying explaining the impacts. We want to see an answer. The answer is here, positive impact and also negative impacts. Then you explain. You are now explaining independently, not taking from the sources. If you take an idea from the source, you rephrase it into your own words and you present the argument like in explanations. Why are you saying it brought positive impacts? And why are you saying it brought negative impacts? You explain like on slaves, how were they impacted? They were treated harshly before the coming of the British. But however, the British introduced laws which protected the slaves. How were the Boers affected? The Boers, they were not happy with the coming of the British because the British introduced laws that disadvantaged them. They lost their supply of labor. You are explaining in your own words. Then you go now to find evidence in the sources. And you quote. You find an evidence in the source. You must not copy the evidence. Rephrase. What you must take from the source is the idea and not to copy. So you go to the sources where there's relevant information about the impact of the British colonialism. For example, you want to highlight Ordinance 50. The British introduced the passed on Ordinance 50. Here, you are finding it in this source. That is evidence of the impact. Ordinance 50 brought impacts on the people. How did it impact? The legislation made it difficult to split up enslaved families. It's your evidence, which is positive evidence on the enslaved families. And also the Guardian was appointed to hear formal complaints about harsh treatment of slaves. It's a positive impact that you are getting from source 1B. So you take an idea and you put the source in brackets at the end of the idea. Like you're saying the ordinance made it difficult to split enslaved families. This is the idea that you are taking. This is an evidence that you are taking. So you have got this evidence from source 1B. You put in brackets. That is how you quote. There's another idea that you can get from another source. You write the idea and you put the source, maybe it's source 1C in brackets at the end of the idea. That is how you take your evidence and present it. Right, then lastly, we are supposed to link, show that whatever you are saying there is supporting the answer. Because the answer here is saying positive and negative. So you provide a closing statement which shows that whatever you were explaining here in the paragraph is giving us an impression of positive impacts and negative impacts. Like you are saying, the British laws led to moderate to fair treatment of the Khoi and slaves. This is positive. While the Boers were made to lose part of their labor force. It's a linking statement which you can close with for your paragraph. It's showing that there was positive because of moderated to fair treatment, and also the British losing their labor force was negative. The Boers losing their labor force is negative. So that is basically how you answer and attempt paragraph questions. Right then, that paragraph will be in PIL format and is going to guarantee you that you get a level 3 presentation, which is either 6, 7, or 8 out of 8. Right, then we just want to discuss part of the essay question. Right, the question is on expansion, cooperation and conflict on the Highveld. That is the focus question. Explain to what extent the colonial expansion after 1750 led to the cooperation and conflict on the Highveld between the Boers, the British, and the Basutos. Right, substantiate line of argument using relevant evidence. Right, in your introduction, remember you're supposed to provide the 3 steps required for an introduction. For your introduction to be contextualized and for it to be answering the question, you are supposed to give an introduction with the 3 steps which are mandatory. Right. So we are saying, the question is saying to what extent? Number 1, number 2, and number 3. This is your introduction. If it doesn't have those three, then your introduction is not contextualized. Right, number one, your introduction must be having an answer to the question. You must respond directly to the question. It must have a line of argument. Then number two, it must have reasons. And then number three, it must have an elaboration, or it must have orientation. Without those three, your introduction is not contextualized, is not addressing and fulfilling the requirements of what we call a contextualized introduction in history presentation. So what you must do, you must start by answering the question directly, respond to the question. The question is saying, explain to what extent. We want to see the extent. To what extent the colonial expansion after 1750 led to. Right, so we are saying the extent must address the question to a greater extent or to a lesser extent. That is your answer to the question. We must see the extent in the opening statement to show that you are answering the question. Then why are you saying it is to the greater extent that colonial expansion led to? What happened that make you believe that it was colonial expansion that led to cooperation and conflict? Cooperation, we are saying, what instances of working together were there because of colonial expansion in the Highveld? Which groups were working together and which groups were conflicting with one another? So you highlight, you are not saying you are explaining there, you are highlighting events of cooperation and conflict. You're just highlighting. The Boers conflicted with the Basutus over land in the Caledon Valley. The British cooperated with the Basutus. They were working well, they were working together. Whatever you give, reasons why you are saying there was cooperation and conflict in the Highveld because of colonial expansion after 1750. Then you give an elaboration as step number three. What is the essay going to prove? What historical evidence are you going to use? This essay will further elaborate instances of cooperation or instances of conflict that happened in the Highveld as a result of the expansion of the colonial frontiers. That is an elaboration. You are now giving the reader a direction of where your essay is going and what focus your essay is going to portray. So in this essay here, you're supposed to look at instances of cooperation and instances of conflict. So as you're explaining, remember you're supposed to structure your paragraphs in the pill format. I'll just highlight some of the ideas that you can use for this essay. Right. You have to look at Mushweshwe on the Highveld. Then after Mushweshwe was on the Highveld, we also need to check on the arrival of the Boers. That's the initial step. And then the British. Mushweshwe occupied the Highveld first, then these guys later on followed, the Boers followed, and also the British followed in the same area. Then, because of that conflict over land, we are seeing that there is possibility of conflict over land because we are now having three different groups in the same area. So the possibility of conflict over land, you explain how they conflicted over land. Specifically, you can talk of the Caledon Valley. The Caledon Valley. In the Caledon Valley instance, we are saying Mushweshwe allowed the Boers to use the land. This is cooperation. Moshoeshoe is allowing the Boers to use the land in the Caledon Valley, but later on, we are seeing that the Boers are claiming that the land was theirs. You are given a piece of land to use, but at the end, you claim that it's yours. So this is another instance that you can explain. You explain on the implication of Moshoeshoe giving land to the Boers, which is cooperation. He wanted to work well with them and allowed them to use the Caledon Valley, but later on, they are now claiming that the land was theirs, which also led to conflict. And also, you can check on the increase in the number of Boers. As time went by, more and more Boers joined in the Highveld. And also, this facilitated that there was going to be more land needed. As they increased in number, it meant that there more land was needed, which also led to conflict. Where were they going to take the land from? Whom were they going to dispossess of their land for them to get more land as they were increasing in numbers? Then you can also look at cooperation by Moshoeshoe, the diplomatic, seeking protection, Moshoeshoe felt like if he got into conflict with the Boers, he could not match with them. So he apparently asked for protection from the British, which is cooperation. And also, if you look at another cooperation, is Moshoeshoe. Moshoeshoe ultimately gave a piece of land between the Caledon and Orange River. For white settlement. This is cooperation. Moshoeshoe is allowing the whites to have a piece of land from the Caledon Valley until Orange River to show that he was cooperating with them. Then we can also look at conflict. There was a war between Moshoeshoe and the British. And the British, which shows that there was there was conflict. So as you write your essay, you try to show that in whatever you are saying, there is an instance of cooperation and also there is an instance of conflict amongst those three groups. So you're focusing on the Basotho under Moshoeshoe, and you focus on the British, and you focus on the Boers. Right. So there's a lot that you can talk about in terms of cooperation and conflict on the Highveld. And as you come to the end of your discussion, remember you must provide a contextualized conclusion. And your conclusion, you are saying you tie up your argument. Tie up your argument. You cannot introduce anything new here. You cannot end a discussion by introducing new ideas. You just have to reaffirm the key ideas that you presented in the essay without presenting them the very same way you presented them in the presentation. And also remember, there should be no underlining, there should be no subheading, there should be no highlighting. Your essay is written plain and continuously in paragraphs. You don't put bullets, you don't put subheadings. We know that the first part of your presentation must be the introduction, and we see that it's an introduction by checking on the three requirements. They must be your answer to the question, and they must be reasons why you answered the question in that direction, and they also must be an elaboration or an orientation of what you're going to present, then we know that this is introduction. Then as we go through our paragraphs, we follow and check to see if they are conforming to PIL. Is there an independent answer in the opening statement of every paragraph that you're writing? And you explain, and you give substance, you give evidence, examples, and you link back your paragraph to show that this is cooperation, to show that this is conflict. How is this conflict? How is this cooperation? You link back to a line of argument. Then at the end, you tie up your argument in the conclusion. Right. So basically, I think those are some of the ideas that you can use when you are answering this essay question. Right, but those are some just of the ideas that you can use, but there are so many other ideas that you can use to show that there was cooperation and also there was a conflict in the Highveld between the British, the Boers, and the Basotho. Right, that takes us